Tonight, the government announces new emergency measures to stop prisons running out of space. Well, this week we went inside one of the UK's most overcrowded jails to see the scale of the crisis firsthand. And today, the Justice Secretary has revealed the UK is set to run out of prison places in November. To try and tackle the issue, 3 new jails will be built and recall time for offenders is being reduced. Are you prepared to be unpopular?
I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to keep this country safe, to make sure that we never run out of prison places.
Also tonight, an exclusive, will play you the leaked recording of a top Conservative shadow minister talking about the flaws in the plan to return illegal migrants after Brexit. Plus, Canada's new Prime Minister Mark Carney tells Sky News that Canadians weren't impressed by the government's decision to offer Donald Trump a second state visit to the UK. And as new research shows the difference in the average cost of a pint around the UK, we'll look at how Parliament compares. With me throughout and never shy to get their round in, Ayesha Hazarika and Pursglove, who'll be with us for the next hour. It's Wednesday, I'm Sophy Ridge live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Right now, there is a crisis in prisons. To put it in the simplest form, we don't have enough space to lock up the number of criminals that we want to. I've been spending time at Preston Prison for work purposes, I should probably clarify, and it came across so strongly there. Look, it's just the same people going back again and again to a prison that, like so many others, doesn't have enough space for them. Well, now we've got the government's response. Build 3 more prisons and make changes to recall to basically reduce the number of criminals being sent back to prison for doing things they shouldn't when they've been released. But even that, they say, won't be enough to stop the number of free spaces reducing to 0, which would, according to the government, lead to a breakdown of law and order where police can't make arrests. I do have one question, though, that still needs answering. You know, if the government is really prepared to have this fight, that fewer people should be sent to jail, who are they talking about? Women in jail for non-violent offences? Shoplifters? People with mental health issues? But we can't just talk about this in the abstract. You know, if we really do want to stop sending some people to prison, we need to know who. And if they're not prepared to answer that question, I can't help wondering if they have the courage they're going to need for this fight. The seriousness of the crisis in prisons was underlined today when the Justice Secretary gave a press conference inside Downing Street. Old, underfunded and overcrowded. At this Victorian prison in Preston, they're clear. Britain's prison system is on its knees.
We are overstretched, under-resourced, and people are constantly just coming back into custody. The prisoners that we're releasing, they're coming back in weeks later and we're having to start all over again to try and get them things in place from when they do get out.
6 months ago, emergency measures were introduced to release offenders early, but now a stark warning from the Justice Ministry's top official.
On our current trajectory, the prison population rises by 3,000. And now we expect to hit 0 capacity to entirely run out of prison places for adult men in November of this year.
The new crisis is forcing the government to spend big.
This is a total capital investment of £4.7 billion. It allows us to start building 3 new prisons.
But it's not the spending that's going to be the most difficult thing, although that will also be tough. It's the politics. The public seem to want prisoners locked up for longer, according to the polling. Are you prepared to be unpopular?
The thing I'm prepared to do is to make sure we never, ever run out of prison places again.
Are you prepared to be unpopular?
I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to keep this country safe, to make sure that we never run out of prison places and that we never see the collapse of either the prison system or our wider law and order system in this country, and that we never put that at risk ever again.
The new measures aim to free up around 1,400 spaces, but we've already got a sense of the fierce political fight to come.
She's focused on releasing criminals early who have reoffended or have breached their licence conditions. If she brought forward measures to get foreign criminals out of our prisons or to get our courts sitting 7 days a week, we would back her tomorrow. If she brought them before Parliament, we would be here sitting tomorrow to support her. We know the situation is difficult, but she's making bad choices, and these are choices that are going to put the public in danger.
The thing that I'm left thinking about, though, is this. They're still talking about building more prisons. They're talking about running out of places, and that's why they need to bring the reforms in. If they were really brave, what they would be talking about now is making these reforms because it is the right thing to do. And I can't help thinking that unless they're willing to have that fight, which will be difficult, don't get me wrong, then are things really going to change? This is the moment when we will see the colour of this Keir Starmer government. Is this real change or more plastering over the cracks? Well, for more on this, I spoke to the Prisons Minister, Lord Timpson, just before we came on air. 2 interviews in a week, must be serious. Can you just talk me through the measures you're announcing today?
So we have inherited a crisis in our prison system. And if we don't act now, we will run out of places in November. And what that means is we'll have a complete breakdown in the criminal justice system. The police won't be able to arrest people, the courts won't be able to charge people, and it will be an absolute disaster. So we need to act now. So what we're doing is we're taking a measure on the way we recall prisoners to make sure we get some capacity, because we're building 14,000 prisons, which we need to do. But also we've got the David Gauke review, which will be announced very shortly. And his job has been to make sure we have a sustainable prison system, because you cannot run a system in crisis like we have now, where every day you don't know whether you're going to have enough prison places.
Big part of the announcement is building new prisons. I mean, as you just said, prison spaces for men are due to run out by November. I mean, you need to give me the number of your builder, because I've got no idea how you're supposed to, this is just going to be way too late, isn't it, for the current crisis?
Well, we're on track to have the 14,000 built by 2031, and that means that we will have a sustainable prison system. But it's not just about building prison places. You've got to do other things as well, and that's what David Gauke's review is going to be looking at, is how we can make sure we have a system that is sustainable. So when people leave, they become really good citizens, not really good criminals. And that's why we've looked around at other examples in Texas and Spain and so on to get all the best ideas, use all the evidence, so we can actually have a sustainable system. I'm
keen to talk about the longer-term plan in a minute, but just on today's announcements, and specifically on recall, which is effectively sending people back to prison if they breach the terms of their licence, if they do things that they shouldn't do. Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, has blasted these changes. He said, instead of reducing those numbers, Labour have decided to let out criminals who reoffend early. They're siding with criminals over the public. What would you say to that?
Well, I think he should look at the last 14 years, where they only built a net 500 prison places, which is clearly not enough, and that's why we've got the crisis we've got now.
He says that, to be fair. He says that they didn't do enough, but he's talking about your plans now. He says you're siding with criminals.
Well, that is not true at all. We are protecting the public, and we're protecting the public by taking these measures and making sure we don't run out of prison places. And I've been going around prisons for over 20 years. I'm really passionate about prisons. And I am absolutely devastated to see the situation that we inherited. It's totally unacceptable. And, it is our job to we've got to do this, and we've got to make sure we don't run out of prison places. So we're building new prisons, and we've got the sentencing review that we're looking at when that comes out.
It's not just the opposition, though, who do have concerns about some of these measures. On Monday, we obviously spoke in Preston. I also spoke to Dame Nicole Jacobs, who is the Domestic Abuse Commissioner. And she said the question she wants asking is, do we have the safeguarding measures in place for victims of domestic abuse? I don't think we do yet. I don't know of a significant plan in place with the Ministry of Justice, with Probation, which allows for monitoring offenders in the community. She's got a point, hasn't she?
So one of the things that we are really determined to do is to make sure our focus is very much on victims and future victims too. So that's why, as our recall measures, we've got a number of exceptions in there. People, serious offenders, people who we are dealing with in a very precise way. But what is really important is we cannot run out of prison places. That is the biggest crisis of the lot.
Domestic abuse, I think, is a specific case, isn't it, where people really, the victims, it makes a huge difference to their life if the perpetrator isn't anywhere near them, if they're breaching the terms of their licence. And as you know, often domestic abuse perpetrators are convicted for things that aren't just directly domestic abuse. It can be quite hard to know who they are.
So that's why in the exceptions, a number of those exceptions are for domestic abuse type offences. But one of the other things is that we're really interested in technology. So when people leave prison, they can go on an electronic tag, GPS tag, or even an alcohol tag, so we know where they are, and also the offenders, we can make sure that the offenders do not go near the victims.
Now, I just want to, take a pause and kind of move away from, the classic interview we see all the time in Westminster and just talk to you about these issues, because they're so important. Now, As you know, we filmed in Preston, at the prison in Preston this week, and it was pretty shocking, I thought, what we found. The merry-go-round of people going back to prison, the same thing, people going to jail again and again. And one thing that officers kept telling me is that a significant number of people are going to prison who shouldn't be going to prison. Do you agree with them?
I think the courts do a fantastic job, and they look at the evidence in front of them, and they send people to prison who they feel who commit these various offences. But the real problem is, for me, is that too many people are leaving prison and reoffending again and again, and often being recalled. So there are 13,000 people in prison, as you met many of them in Preston, who are there being recalled. And they're being recalled because their behaviour is either showing higher risk or they've committed further offences.
Recall came up a lot in Preston as well. I accept that lots of people think that's an issue, but just specifically on people going to prison who shouldn't be going to prison, because that is what the officers were telling me as well. They're talking specifically about young people, about people who've been in care, about people with mental health issues, about non-violent offenders, about women. And they're basically saying that once they go into prison, that they almost come out worse than before because they get used to prison, they get indoctrinated in prison, they may fall in with the wrong people. Do you agree with them that we're sending people to prison who shouldn't be there?
I do not agree with that. What I agree with is that, I mean, if you take, we've spoken about this before, if you take female offenders, 80% of female offenders that go to prison are there for non-violent offences. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't go to prison, but there are a number of them who have children and are actually victims themselves. So that's why when we set up the Women's Justice Board, that was part of the work we're doing on that. But one of the biggest problems for me is that people are leaving prison not rehabilitated. They haven't been educated, they haven't been learning English and maths, they haven't been doing personal activity, they haven't been behaving well when they're in prison, and that is why they're going round and round in the system again. But even within that, every year the prison population increases by 3,000 people. So you've got to build 3,000 cells to cater for the increasing growth all the time. But that's unsustainable. So you've got to do something else, and the something else has got to be about how do you punish people in the community and how do you stop people offending.
You see, I guess this is what I'm trying to get my head around, right? Because you say you want big reform, you say that it's unsustainable, the number of people who are going to prison, but you won't say that people are going to prison who shouldn't be. And it feels to me that if you're going to be brave with these reforms, if you're going to really shake things up, then you need to make that a mission.
Well, we have an independent judiciary, and it's their job to decide who goes to prison. We've got the sentencing review, and when that is published, hopefully imminently, we'll be able to talk about, we'll be able to look at what David Gork and the panel have come up with, and then work our way through that. But for me, we need more prison places. We always need a place for dangerous people to go, and we need the police to be able to operate.
Where's Keir Starmer's head on all this?
Well, the Prime Minister has been incredibly supportive and incredibly aware of the challenges that we're under. And I remember when I was first appointed, and a journalist asked him about why they've appointed someone who ran a shoe repair business to do this job, even though I like to think I'm quite qualified to do this job. And he said, it's very clear we can't have more prisoners than we have prison places. And he is very aware of the problems that we're dealing with and has been incredibly supportive.
OK, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, with us this evening, the former Labour Party advisor Ayesha Hazarika and the former Home Office Minister Tom Pursglove, and also our correspondent Molly Malone, who's been doing an awful lot of work looking into the prison system over the last 18 months. Molly, it's great to have you with us because, I kind of feel you're almost like Sky's resident expert, when it comes to this topic. You've been to a lot of prisons, you've spoken to an awful lot of people about these issues. What did you make of today?
Well, I think what today was all about this issue of recall, and in layman terms, look at the kind of public that might hear that and think, what's recall? It's that same faces idea, the same people going back in and out of prison quite regularly all the time. Basically, recall can happen for a couple of reasons. One is a further offence. Two is kind of if you're breaching your licence conditions. So they're attachments to your kind of probation period, if you like. Once you leave prison, you have to abide by quite strict licence conditions. The majority of recalls, 75%, are happening for what's called non-compliance. So that's not turning up to a probation appointment, missing a probation appointment, perhaps not reporting a new address that you moved to. 25% is for further offending. So we've got a massive recall population at the moment amounting to about 15% of the total prison population in England and Wales. So that's the kind of backdrop that they're operating in. The changes that they've made, so previously short-term recalls, so when you get recalled to prison for a short amount of time and then get automatically released, were only for people serving sentences originally of 12 months. So in theory, in the government's view, less serious offenders. The changes today mean that it can be applied to people of up to 4 years, so more serious offenders. Previously, those people would have had to be sat before the parole board. They'd have to prove to the parole board that they were safe to leave. That won't happen anymore because it was the government's view that these recalls were just kind of clogging up the system. The backdrop, as we know, we've seen it over the last 18 months, is overcrowding. We're at 99% capacity in the male's prison estate again. But this is a policy that some will see as another emergency measure. They're sort of lurching from one thing to the next ahead of the sentencing review, where they say meaningful reform will come, but big pressure on David Gauke.
Yeah, I'll be honest, before I went to Preston Prison earlier this week, I didn't actually realise what a big deal this recall stuff is, but it came up an awful lot there. Actually, the officer was saying what a large number of people it affects. But Molly, the other thing I do want to talk to you about is some victims' bodies are really worried about these changes, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. And you can understand because from their perspective, for the last 18 months, 2 years, they've seen the early release policy where lots of offenders are being released early from prison after serving 40% of their sentence rather than 50%. And now this, they can probably feel quite upset by it. We've actually heard from the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales, Nicole Jacobs, who's just put out a statement saying she cannot stress the lack of consideration for victim safety and how many lives are being put in danger because of this proposed change. So clearly they're seeing that they've got overcrowding, but they feel that victims are paying the price for it.
Molly, thank you very much indeed. Molly Malone there. Well, let's bring in Ayesha and Tom, shall we? Tom, to you first, because look, Robert Jenrick of your party's put out a really punchy statement. He says, look, this is Labour taking the side of criminals, not victims. What do you think?
Well, I think Robert is right to acknowledge that there are things that we could have done differently during our time in government. I think we could have been more strategic about this. And I, for one, certainly support the creation of additional spaces. There's good learning in the system. For example, in recent years, we've seen the creation of Five Wells and Foss Way and Millsite, which opened just a few weeks ago. So I think we can definitely support that. But I also recognise, and you would expect me to say this as a former victims minister, that victims have to be at the forefront of this and people have to believe that justice is being done and that justice is seen to be being done. I also think that you just have to confront a number of realities too when talking about this, big systemic challenges. Firstly, in recent times, and there's been cross-party support for a lot of these changes, we've criminalised a lot more people for a lot of additional offences and often for longer.
What kind of offences?
Also, well, I mean, for example, and quite rightly, we have increased sentences for violent offenders, the most serious sexual offences, people who commit the most appalling of crimes, but also in other areas too. I think those are the right things to do, but they're not cost-free options and they throw up a lot of challenges. But it also goes right back to the point about migration as well and the population, the size of the population in this country. And the reality is that the number of people that we have here makes pressure on public services like prisons a very real challenge.
Ayesha, what's your take on it?
Well, look, I just do think that when you look at the criminal justice system, whether it's the court backlogs, whether it was the cuts to the police service and the parlour state of the prisons, I do think, and this is no disrespect to you, but I do think the Tories should sit this one out in terms of law and order because it was a terrible legacy that was left. But there is a Labour government now and it is very, very difficult. The one thing I will say, though, is I think that James Timpson is a really brilliant appointment. He's somebody who's steeped, and there's a lot of cross-party consent. He's somebody that has kind of lived in this world for a long time, so he's not going in and learning his brief. But he does care about it, and I think you've got to do a combination of things. Building more prison places is absolutely imperative. Trying to sort of work out how to stop reoffending. But that in itself is also complicated. You need a very well-resourced probation service. I know you're just going to, we're going to be doing that. You need housing for prisoners coming out. You need some stability in terms of mental health issues, addictions, issues, prostitution issues for a lot of women coming out. There's an argument, should women even be in prison? And also opportunities. And one of the things that James Timpson, of course, is famous for through Timpson's is hiring ex-offenders. So this is a really complicated, nuanced, and all of this costs money as well. This stuff is so important, and rightly so, feelings about the victims and also society, because if people have done bad crimes, people do want justice.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult balance to get right. But James Timpson is, I think, a good brain thinking about this.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I'll be honest, like, it's not an area that I've never, it's one of the first times I've been to, a prison, and actually spending that time there, talking to the officers, talking to prison was such an eye-opener to me. Because you realise it is just the same people. You realise that not everyone is getting rehabilitated and how overcrowded it is too. But then you look at the polling, and the polling all points one way. And this is just what I can't really square in my mind, because I think there's agreement that, someone like James Timpson is in it for the right reasons. He's trying to make change. But I just feel that, will number 10, I guess, have the courage to be unpopular, is my question. And Molly, you've been looking at this with women's prisons as well, haven't you?
Yeah, we were discussing it on Monday, weren't we, in Preston? You'd think in the public's mind, if anything, the kind of potential backdrop of some women offenders, lots of them are victims of domestic abuse, more than half of them have children on the outside, perhaps the public might be more sympathetic to kind of alternatives to prison for them, for the sake of their children, perhaps wider society, some would argue. It doesn't seem that they are. And if you're not taking the public with you on the kind of potentially more empathetic cases, then how's it going to work? How's it going to sell?
And this number 10, let's be honest, Ayesha, they look at the polling, they're aware of it, aren't they?
Yeah, they're very polling sensitive.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say. But also remember, Keir Starmer is pragmatic. He himself is from the Crown Prosecution Service, and I think what you just can't have is this continuation of the same, where you have, as you say, first-time offenders going into some of these really hardcore prisons. That often becomes a university of crime, where often a first-time offender will go in and almost get tutelage in how to become a more hardened criminal. They come out, there's no support network, and you start this revolving door of... So something has got to change in the system, because as good as it is that more prison places are being built, and Tom will know this having been a minister, you can't build your way out of this problem.
Yeah,
and
what's
that's
your
the strategic
take from
point. So funnily enough, I was in a prison a few weeks ago, and one of my big passions now, I'm not in Parliament.
Not because you did a crime,
not because I've been wrong.
Just feel like I need to just clarify all
for all of the right
I've
reasons.
got a newsline there.
No, for all the right reasons. But one of my big passions outside of Parliament remains around employment.
Yeah.
And one of the big challenges that I was talking to people at this particular prison about, both offenders but also the staff, was around housing.
Yeah.
And so much of this falls down around housing.
Yeah.
Because if you can get durable solutions in place for people, if you can find somewhere for them to live and a job attached to that, you can solve so much of this, because you get people into the right routine and you retain all of those positives from the rehabilitation, from being in that world of work within prison. I don't think we look at that strategically enough. So, for example, many prisoners are not in prison in a place that is adjacent to their local community.
Yeah.
So you then lose a continuity of the link between the support that they've been getting in prison and perhaps the worker that they've been working with to sort their rehabilitation out, to get them back into the outside world. And so much of it, I think, falls down because of those challenges.
It's totally
Because people are so... There's that point when people come out of prison where the male, female, so vulnerable. And I think if you can kind of do a wraparound situation, which is, as you say, housing, opportunity, mental health services, often addiction services as well, you have a chance. And also, look, we are in a country where there's big vacancies in a lot of areas. And I've spoken to different people where actually a lot of employers are quite open-minded about trying to give ex-offenders an opportunity. So you sort of think with some creative thinking, there should be a kind of holistic solution. But I go back to the point, this takes bravery, takes political courage, to your point. It takes bringing people with you, including lots of victims, and having guardrails. And it takes resources, because if to do this properly, it's difficult. And that's a very difficult thing for the government as well, because the fiscal backdrop is hard at the moment as well. And also, we do have to do that hard thinking of what is driving people into crime. Look, there's a lot of people who are just bad people, and they'll do that. But there are other societal factors that we do need to think about it. The other thing is technology as well. There's, I was at a really interesting discussion about facial recognition, and could that be used more for police along with tag, because the tagging is quite sophisticated now. So maybe there's some technology solutions that could help as well.
Yeah, it's something the government seems to be talking about increasingly.
I mean, you look at the live facial recognition pilots that have been run, we should be rolling this out. I mean, they found in London 600 offenders that they'd been searching for, identified on live facial recognition, were able to pull them in, including very violent individuals. So
We've got to be... on the street or something?
Yeah.
Or? Just
Exactly.
cameras on the
so
streets.
deploying this
they-
technology in communities.
They're doing some
and
pilots at
really
the moment,
pushing
and they are.
forward
That is something. I mean, look, that has to be properly tested, and of course, there's make sure the safeguards. You don't want to make sure that people are doing false positives and catching the wrong people. But this could be another useful tool to help. So if you do have people, out on with conditions, this could be part of it. But all of this has to be done with the discussion with the victim side of it as well, because you're only going to build consent and try and change things if you bring people, and the victims are really important on this as well.
Yeah, it's a crucial thing, isn't it, with the victims in particular. Molly, we're going to do the probation interview shortly. The Chief Inspector of Probation is going to be with us very soon. How important is probation when it comes to getting this right?
Well, I think it's going to become increasingly important because at the moment we've got a kind of prison-centric model. At the moment it's sort of one emergency measure to the next. Everyone's looking at the prison numbers. But actually, if we see in the sentencing review what has been kind of trailed, what we expect, there's going to be a massive focus on probation, more people managed in the community. And right now the service say they're on their knees. The Chief Inspector of Probation itself in its inspection earlier in the year said it's not adequate, it's not performing the way it needs to be. And they just don't feel the resources there, they don't feel the system's working. So if you add to their caseload again and again and again, which is probably what's going to happen, well, things are going to have to change for them, I think.
Molly, thank you very much. We'll have lots more from both of you throughout the programme as well. But on the line now is Martin Jones, who is the Chief Inspector of Probation. Let's get his reaction. Thank you for joining us. What do you make of the government's announcements today?
Huge pressure.
Apologies, I am just going to break you off there because, as you obviously realise, if you're watching from home, we couldn't hear what was going on there. We're going to try and get it fixed. Actually, you know what? I mean, we're going to give it another go right now. Fingers crossed. Can I just go back to you and see if I can hear you this time, which is always helpful in an interview. What did you make of the reforms, Martin?
So good evening. I certainly think the Lord Chancellor had no choice but to announce these changes. You can't run out of prison places. It has significant consequences for the criminal justice system. But as Chief Inspector of Probation, my concern is whether the probation service can cope with these changes. Now, the probation service is already under huge strain. It has too few staff with too little experience managing too many cases. So I'm looking for a long-term view here in relation to the resources the probation service will need to manage a significant number of cases coming out of prison and being managed in the community. At the moment, my inspection reports find there's significant underperformance on the front line with a very inexperienced staff group. It needs more resources for the long term.
I thank you for the honesty of your answer. Just to, I guess, ask you for the direct response to the question that you posed. Can the probation service cope currently?
So I think it's really important to be clear. Last summer, the government introduced the SDS 40 changes. The probation service, let's be clear about this, performed heroics against a really difficult backdrop to ensure that that scheme was managed as well as was possible in that circumstances, and I publicly praise them for that. But at the time, I also cautioned about the risk, for example, of many of those people being released being recalled to custody because of the pressure on the probation service. And obviously, the Lord Chancellor has announced further changes to recall, and I welcome that because recall has been a significant problem for some time. The number of people recalled to custody has doubled over the last 8 years or so. So something needs to be done about that. But you need to understand the reasons why that's an issue. And some of that is the lack of support in the community. You know, if people are being released from prison and they're homeless, that has a significant impact on the risk. They may reoffend, they may breach their licence conditions. So the system needs to do better. And whilst I support the need to ensure we have enough prison places, we also need to ensure the probation service is properly funded and properly staffed to deliver the change we need to ensure that communities are safe.
You mentioned their recall, and it was something that came up an awful lot when I visited Preston Prison, both from prisoners and officers, effectively saying that people were just getting recalled, sent back to prison, not because they're committing crimes, just because they are doing things like missing appointments and so on. Why is that happening? Is that basically because probation is so stretched and there are too many inexperienced staff, so it's a bit kind of computer says no? Is that the problem?
So to be fair to probation officers, there's always a reason for recall, and generally speaking, it does involve people that are not complying with their licence conditions, and licence conditions are important for the protection of the public. But I think it was better resourced if probation officers had a bit more time to spend understanding the issues that people face. If somebody's leaving prison, they've still got a drug addiction because nothing is happening to fix those problems, and they don't have a house to live in, you're going to have problems with that person complying with the order. So why don't we try to fix those issues? If you can do that, you'd get much better outcomes. The one thing that I would say is the recall population has doubled in a period when the probation service has been under huge pressure, huge strain, and suffered huge change. And I think there's no coincidence that the numbers have increased over that same period.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We understand the point you're trying to make there. I want to ask you about victims, because we've had a really powerful statement put out by the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, Nicole Jacobs, in response to the changes made by the government. She says, "I cannot stress the lack of consideration for victims' safety and how many lives are being put in danger because of his proposed change. Perpetrators of domestic abuse know everything about their victim, where they live, where they work, where their children go to school. Re-releasing them after 28 days is simply unacceptable." What would you say to those fears?
Well, I used to be in charge of the parole board, so I've had many victim meetings with victims over my time in the criminal justice system. We have to listen to the voice of victims here, ensure they have reassurance that licence conditions will properly protect them, that we have tagging, for example, in place to ensure that they are protected. We need to ensure that the voice of victims is heard when the government is thinking about the sentencing reforms that are going to be brought forward, and obviously the sentencing review coming out from David Gauke. Because if we do that, we won't be meeting their needs. Now, there are protections in place around, for example, some of the most serious offences. But ultimately, how do you judge whether somebody is going to commit, for example, a relatively serious domestic abuse offence? I think it's a really important point that we've got to get a balance here. But ultimately, the system cannot grind to a halt. And what I would really look for is a long-term answer to this question rather than short-term measures. Ultimately, what you're seeing here is almost the impact of that dreadful pressure on the system. And there are no good choices to be made in this. And I think we're almost at the position of last resort here.
It's been really interesting to talk to you. Thank you so much for being on the programme today.
Thank you.
Well, today's prisons announcement is sure to feature in tomorrow's newspapers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the associate editor of the Daily Mirror, Kevin Maguire, and the political commentator, one you might know, Adam Bolton. You're watching the Politics Hub. Lots still to come tonight, including, has Brexit made it harder to return asylum seekers? We've got a secret recording of the Shadow Home Secretary linked to our very own Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. That story is next.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls. and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Welcome back. The Shadow Home Secretary has appeared to have admitted the Conservatives' Brexit deal made it harder for the government to return asylum seekers. Chris Philp's comments were made in a leaked secret recording. Sky's deputy political editor Sam Coates has the story, and he joins us now outside at the Skypad. Sam.
This is the week that the government puts forward its plans to overhaul legal and illegal migration, because it's considered by many members of the public to be out of control. But the question we're asking today is the manner in which we left the European Union back in 2020, did that actually contribute to problems on our borders and mean that more people came in than the public could tolerate? Now, this isn't a question that Tories have previously raised problems with our Brexit deal, because they were so often told things like this.
Illegal immigration.
So, you've got there a very clear sign that ministers did not want to talk about the downsides at the time. But, Sophie, I want to talk about this. He is Chris Philp. He's the Shadow Home Secretary, and he really matters in this debate because he was also the immigration minister at the point that Britain was leaving the European Union and all its structures. And in a leaked recording of a meeting that he held with Tory members at the end of April, so really, really recently, he appeared to suggest that actually the way that we left the EU, the way that that Brexit deal was negotiated, did cause problems. Now, he's about to refer in the recording I'm going to play you to something called the Dublin Arrangements. That's the EU-wide agreement that means that people inside the bloc can transfer and remove asylum seekers back to the country where they first applied if they've gone on somewhere else. And he appears to suggest that leaving the EU and leaving that arrangement is a problem. Listen to what he had to say.
Now, because we're out of the European Union now, we are out of the Dublin III regulations, and so we can't any longer rely on sending people back to the place where they first claimed asylum. When we did check it out, just before we exited the EU transitional arrangements on December the 31st, 2020, we did run some checks and found that about half the people crossing the Channel had claimed asylum previously elsewhere in Europe, in Germany, France, Italy, Spain, somewhere like that, and therefore could have been returned. But now we're out of Dublin, we can't do that, and that's why we need to have somewhere like Rwanda that we can send these people to as a deterrent.
Now, I think that's interesting, partly because he appears to admit that they were still doing research on exactly what would happen just before we left the European Union and all of its structures late on. So it sounds like quite a lot of last-minute decision-making. But it's also interesting because that absolutely wasn't the story that we were told at the time. Now, in what you just heard from a few weeks ago, Chris Philp was suggesting that the Dublin Agreement was a good thing. Now listen to how he talked about it at the time, back in 2020.
The Dublin regulations do have a number of constraints in them, which makes returning people who should be returned a little bit harder than we would like. Of course, come the 1st of January, we'll be outside of those Dublin regulations, and the United Kingdom can take a fresh approach.
So is this part of the Conservative Party throwing its hands up and saying that it got bits of the Brexit deal wrong? What is it going to say? Well, I asked the Conservative Party for a response, and it emerged, I have to say, it is quite lengthy. They take a lot of positions. They say they did Brexit because the public wanted it, but they did have a plan, and even Chris Philp, they say, wasn't suggesting otherwise, and that they struck lots of agreements, but they need to go even further in order to deal with the problem. So in some ways, the Conservatives are not sure whether or not they should agree with Chris Philp publicly or not. All a little bit of a mess. Clearly, Brexit, a sensitive issue for the Conservative Party. Labour aren't hanging around. This is Mike Tapper, Labour MP.
Demonstrates here that Chris Philp, who was the immigration minister at the time, was saying something completely different behind closed doors and not being honest with the public. Of course, we know we've inherited a really difficult situation. I think it's time for an apology.
The one thing that we're not going to get is an apology from the Conservative Party.
Sam Coates. Sam Coates, thank you very much indeed. Sam Coates there, our Deputy Political Editor. Right, let's bring in Ayesha and Tom again, shall we? Tom, how embarrassing or not do you think this is for Chris Philp and the Conservative Party?
I also think we've got to set this in some contrast. And, you know, actually, when I joined the Home Office The first time I was a minister in the department, I was briefed by officials on the Dublin Agreement, and actually this is negligible difference. What we were talking about was being able to return perhaps a few hundred people on the basis of that. That is not going to markedly change the dynamics that we currently face today. I think it's just important to set it in the context there. Actually, if you're really serious about tackling the issue of returns and getting those with no right to be here out of this country, I would of course welcome an EU-wide returns agreement. We actually put that forward as part of the negotiation as we sought to leave the European Union. That wasn't something the EU wanted to do. It would be a good thing. I don't see a prospect of that at the moment. But fundamentally, our biggest challenges come down to Article 3 and Article 8 claims and all of those barriers that we so often see thrown up to frustrate removal.
Ayesha.
Well, I think it's a great scoop from Sam there. And look, at the end of the day, when you just look at the raw figures, and I was just looking at the immigration chart back to sort of, you know, the early 2000s and where we got to sort of now, I mean, the figures have just absolutely shot up, and they did shoot up under a Conservative government. So I think it's just not good enough to say, oh, this would only have, you know, worked with a small number of people. It just kind of shows...
But that was the practical reality in the years
you have
where this
to
was
use
applicable.
everything. The government of the day has to use sort of every trick in the book on this, because it is difficult. I'm not saying it's
hard.
easy.
It's very difficult.
But I do think, you know, it is interesting to hear Chris Philp, who's very punchy on this. You know, he is now the spokesman. He's out every day, you know, punching it to the government. But it's interesting privately hearing this admission that you know, this was a failure. I mean, he is admitting that this was a policy failure. But the substantive issue is that this is very, very difficult. The government has come out with its immigration white paper now, and there's been a lot of controversy about that. But they are trying to take measures to try and kind of bring the figures down. They are, of course, trying to put a lot of money and time and resources into tackling illegal immigration as well, and the small boats. But yeah, it's just interesting hearing Chris Philp say that in private while saying something very different in public.
Okay, thanks both very much indeed, Tom and Ayesha there. Now, in his first major interview since winning last month's general election, the newly elected Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has told Sky News his voters were not impressed by Keir Starmer's decision to invite Donald Trump for a second state visit. Mr Carney was speaking to Sky's Sam Washington ahead of the King's visit to open Canada's Parliament later this month, the first time a British monarch has performed the role for nearly 50 years.
Mark Carney sworn in as Canada's Prime Minister for the second time this year. An improbable election victory made possible in part by Donald Trump's threats. Having campaigned on a message that America wanted to break Canada in order to own it, the former Bank of England governor has called on his king for help.
His Majesty coming sends a message first and foremost to Canadians. All issues around Canadian sovereignty have been accentuated by the President, so no, it's not coincidental.
And it is my pleasure to bring from His Majesty the King.
It follows Sir Keir Starmer personally handing a letter of invitation from the King to the President for an unprecedented second UK state visit.
What did Canadians make of that?
I'll be frank, they weren't impressed by that gesture. Quite simply, given the circumstance. It was at a time when we were being quite clear, some of us were being quite clear about the issues around sovereignty. I was not yet Prime Minister, but I was being clear on the campaign trail, and it cut across some of those messages.
So do you personally think that a state visit to the UK for President Trump is appropriate, given that backdrop?
Well, that's a judgment for the government of the United Kingdom and the Palace.
I'm sure you have an opinion on
Well, you reference, I have opinion on many things, some of which I keep to myself.
The King is going to sit here alongside the Queen. It'll be the first time in nearly 50 years that the head of state will open Parliament here in Canada. The Canadian Prime Minister is clear that it is an assertion of Canadian sovereignty, made all the more important because of Donald Trump's threats.
Despite his campaign rhetoric never to meet the president while he disrespected Canada, Carney's first visit since his election was to the White House.
Why did you meet him?
He was expressing a desire. He wasn't calling, he'd shifted from the expectation to a desire for that to happen. He was also coming from a place where he recognized that wasn't going to happen. I made it clear to him.
Do you think that he ever intended to annex Canada?
There's wish and reality. Did he want to? Did it look like an attractive combination to him? Yes. Does he still muse about it? Perhaps. Is it ever going to happen? No, never.
With Ukraine's sovereignty also imperiled, Trump has positioned himself as peacemaker-in-chief.
Do you trust that he's an honest broker in that regard, in representing the interests of Ukraine, Europe and the West?
I do. A straight answer, I do. The positions of Canada, the UK, all the coalition, the willing, Ukraine and the United States are converging towards this unconditional 30-day ceasefire demand of Russia. So the president has been helpful.
Mark Carney will be hoping Trump's help extends a little closer to home if he's to deliver for Canadians. Samantha Washington, Sky News in Ottawa.
Well, we can speak to Sam now. Sam, what a news-making interview. It was fascinating to see how you managed to get him to open up to you. What was your kind of main takeaway?
Hi, Sophie. Welcome to downtown Ottawa here, of course, the capital, and that's where the King and Queen are going to be coming in just under 2 weeks' time. My main takeaway from the interview is that the thing that we went into it thinking is that the tensions between the Prime Minister in Canada and the President just on the other side of the border, of course, who've been threatening the sovereignty, that is where the real point of tension is. It appears as though, since he took office, they've had a couple of constructive telephone calls. The Oval Office meeting by both sides seems to be proclaimed as a success. It seems like they're trying to forge a path forward, and I think both sides acknowledge that their economies are pretty deeply integrated, albeit that the Americans have some claim to say that the Canadians need them more than the other way around. But the unintended consequence of all of this, of course, is what has happened here with the King, Sophie, because the King is head of state, as you know, in the UK. He's head of state as well in Canada, and both countries have tried to deploy him in quite different ways in order to manage the relationships with President Trump. So the Canadians have effectively used him as a sovereignty shield. They're viewing him as the most potent symbol of sovereignty, reminding President Trump, you know, this country isn't yours. This is our head of state, and a reminder really of the historic alliance with the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom, of course, offering him the invitation as really a bridge, perhaps flattery, some people would say, to try and perhaps flatter the president into offering favourable terms for a trade deal. But what that has done is it's set the two Commonwealth allies who go back, since the beginning of Canadian time, really, as a sort of deeply committed Commonwealth partners. It set them at odds against each other, because the very thing that Canada is trying to achieve is being viewed, particularly by Canadians who are pretty cross about it, as undermining those efforts by Sir Keir Starmer trying to pander to Donald Trump by offering him that coveted, unprecedented second state visit. And what I think is really interesting about that is you'd have thought that given how noisy and disruptive President Trump has been, the natural conclusion is to think that other countries will galvanize. But in some circumstances we've seen that, but it does take time. We've seen it with the coalition of the willing, and it appears as though there's some progress being made on Ukraine with everybody coming together. But it's curious, isn't it, that it can take the disruptive influence of Donald Trump to actually push long-standing allies further apart.
Sam, thank you very much indeed. Samantha Washington there, speaking to the Canadian PM, Mark Carney. All right, let's chat to Ayesha and Tom, shall we? And what did you make of that? It's quite interesting to think that we may have irritated Canada slightly.
I think what's so fascinating about Mark Carney is that he was always seen as a very kind of managerial person, being a Bank of England governor, very much like a technocrat. and he's kind of seamlessly slipped into being this really big political operator. And he's saying these really punchy things, but with great elan and being sort of very kind of elegant. And very like silky about it.
It's almost like you don't almost realise he said it. You can see he said it in this kind of really like ambling way. Then you're like, hang on, sorry, what? He did just say that.
And so what he's actually said, it's quite a big deal. You know, that's quite a big sort of thing that he's ticked off with us about that visit. But I think it's good that he's just been honest about it, but clearly he's such an operator, he'll still be able to do, you know, very good business with us. And what a savvy move to get the King to come and be part of everything in the next 2 weeks. I mean, he is like an operator at a different level.
Yeah, it's true, isn't it? What do you make of how Mark Carney's done them?
Well, look, I think the political achievement of winning that election is quite remarkable, and nobody should underestimate his political abilities. I think he settled this question with President Trump around the future of Canada. I don't think there was ever really anything in it, but it's put it completely off of the pitch in terms of options. And I think, of course, that our government has always got to put our national interests first. I think it's right that we have that state visit in the same way that I supported the state visit that we had when we were in government. But it's, you know, I think it is quite refreshing, actually, to see a leader speak his mind, to say how he sees it, and it's clearly resonating with his voters.
But do it in a way which is not deliberately provocative. He says what he thinks, but you know he's still going to carry on having very good relationships. Actually, his visit to the White House was handled very deftly, I thought, because it could have been a punch-up, as we know from previous. And at one point, I think J.D. Vance sort of slightly tried to goad him. That's obviously the kind of rule. But he didn't go for it. And I think Trump probably might not like what he stands for, but probably respects Mark Carney.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you see different leaders responding in different ways to how, you know, to deal with Donald Trump. And you've got like Keir Starmer, who's obviously been very, very careful not to irritate him, to hug him close. And then you've got Mark Carney, who's just gone for it. He's gone out swinging. I mean, do you think that maybe we should be a bit more Mark Carney?
I think we should definitely have a think about whether we can learn something. And actually, he's been bold, hasn't he? And it clearly paid off electorally. And often you find new prime ministers are quite cautious in those early days and weeks. He's totally blown that out of the water as an approach.
Although I think what was slightly different, though, to be fair to Keir Starmer, with Mark Carney, Trump had said, I want to come after Canada. So he was...
He didn't say he was going to
he was, exactly. And to be fair, Keir Starmer, he has done a good job of getting that first deal diplomatically.
Yeah, it's fair. It's very fair. Thanks both very much indeed. Now, it is a sunny summer evening, at least here in SW1. Apologies if it's not where you are, because I can imagine that's a very annoying thing for me to say. And it is also after 6 p.m. So, you know, the thoughts of the Politics Hub team naturally turn to going for a pint. And it won't surprise you to know that London pubs are pretty expensive, but not so outside Westminster. Now, this map, I think we should show you now, shows the average cost of a pint around Britain. It's data shared by Sky's Money blog. John Craig's magically appeared. We say the word pint and he just appears in the studio. It's like, it's incredible. So the average pint around London is £4.60. London's the most expensive at £5.44. At the other end of the scale, Wales comes in as the cheapest place to buy a pint at £4.21. But how does that compare with the hallowed, taxpayer-subsidised bars on the Parliamentary estate? Well, who better to do some eyewitness journalism on this than our very own John Craig? John, where's the cheapest beer in Westminster?
This was a tough assignment. So, in the past couple of hours, I have been to the Strangers Bar, which is the main bar in Parliament, the Lord's Bar, and also the bar called the Woolsack, which used to be the Sports and Social Club. The cheapest pint I have found in Parliament is in the Lord's Bar. For £4.40, you can get a pint of House of Commons lager or a Green King IPA. Now, the main bar, Strangers Bar, if you remember, it was shut earlier this year after a spiking allegation. So, in Strangers, cheapest there is £4.85 for Carlsberg. Guinness is £5. Estrella £5.20. The guest beers are £5.20 as well. The Woolsack, which tends to be full of younger researchers and has a common staff, well, in the Woolsack, the Estrella's £5.35. Foster's £4.80. Guest ales there, £4.45. So £4. It's £1 or so cheaper, isn't it? Than
it's quite a lot. It's quite a lot cheaper, isn't it?
However, I have to say, an MP told me if you want a really cheap pint in Westminster, the place to go is the Civil Service Club.
Oh, really?
Just up the road, where apparently the beer is about £1 cheaper than it is in Parliament.
What do you make of the bars? Because we kind of have like different opinions, don't we, about, you know, whether it is right that we've got so many bars in Westminster, whether it's right that they're, you know, as John's research, very important, you know, research has showed.
If John doesn't win an RTS award for that, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
there is no justice in the world.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. It is pretty cheap in Westminster, though, isn't it? Should it be?
I think that people out there will have a view about that subsidy. But, you know, it is an unusual workplace, isn't it? In the sense that people often work very long hours. Yeah. There is a social element to it. I think actually MPs and politicians spending time together is a good thing when that's done responsibly. And actually, you do get to know people over a drink in different parties and perhaps come together on issues in a way that you perhaps wouldn't in other environments. But I can understand why people have a view on it.
Favourite bar in Westminster, Ayesha?
Probably the Pugin rooms, which is really...
But you can't get draft beer in there.
That's right.
I mean, that's very
I maybe need to start drinking like the draft lager.
The Pugin room's all gin and tonic.
It is. Although I would like to say I do very little drinking on these things.
Earl Grey tea and cucumber sandwiches, isn't it?
But to Tom's point, right, so take us, for example, in Lords, right, tonight after I leave you, I'll be going back to Lords and we'll probably be there till 1 o'clock in the morning.
Hardcore.
So I do understand people will be shouting at the telly at the moment, but for a lot of people, they are in there for like hours in the evening, although it is not wise to know too much.
People should frequent
You've got a
the
bar
bars.
in the Lords called the Bishop's Bar, haven't you? Which I don't think hacks like me can go in.
We're not allowed in.
No,
At one point, only bishops could go in there. So I think that just got changed quite recently.
I love it. I love it.
People should be in there infrequently. But I think the key question as well is, did John do the taste testing as well as the price ranking?
Yeah.
No, not on this occasion.
Oh, I love it, love
They
it.
do actually serve alcohol-free beers. You can get an alcohol-free Estrella for $3.70 in Strangers, and in some of the other bars as well. So that's a bit cheaper. But, well, I mean, there's tales of Strangers Bar are notorious over the years.
Yeah, it's true.
Anyway, Sophie, it's your round. It's your round.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it's absolute. Yeah, exactly. I'm intrigued by your little research. I'm going to get you to go and do the red wine list next
right,
for me.
The wine in Strangers, a 175ml glass of the House Sauvignon or Merlot is £5.50.
OK, I'm going to take that. Thanks very much. Thanks all very much indeed.
See you.
Now, John Craig's esteemed original journalism, reporting about the bar prices in Parliament notwithstanding, we should probably double source it. Really, shouldn't we? And do some pretty important fact-checking. It is, as we said, a pretty nice sunny evening in Westminster. They look like they're enjoying themselves. It'd be rude not to join them, wouldn't they? We'll see you tomorrow at 7 p.m.